All right, so 5 weeks and 4 days ago, my wife gave birth to our first child. A baby boy named Henry. Now, it would be an understatement to tell you that my life has been transformed in radical ways in only a matter of days. Something that I'm sure a lot of you in the sanctuary can relate to. And it has most certainly affected the content of what I wanted to preach on my first Sunday back with you in the pulpit after paternity leave. Also, I hope that this recent personal history will serve as a moment of grace and explanation for you if my first sermon back with a baby doesn't make any sense at all, or if perhaps for once it's the preacher who falls asleep in the middle of the sermon. Oh, there's a good chance that's going to happen. Like many new parents before us, my wife Kate and I have spent just countless hours doing nothing but staring in awe at this new human life on earth. And we have watched these random hiccups and sneezes and jerking arm movements that our doctors tell us are those of a human nervous system that's firing up like a computer booting up for the first time, has to find its way. I see this being in my home who exemplifies radical dependence. And his new life has highlighted some truths about human relationships to me that I know I just race by all the time. It's hard to imagine that those of us in the room were ever so small. That each and every one of us in the room was so fragile and so very much in need of being held close. And his new life reminds me just how much time as adults we spend trying to pretend we're not fragile anymore. That we still don't need to be held so close. I have this person in my life who doesn't care what party I vote for. Doesn't care whether I'm right or wrong, what I believe or don't believe. His survival does not depend on my being special or unique. His survival depends on my presence. I have been in awe of this person who does not care a bit about my ego. And my son's entrance into the world has been an exercise in the spiritual discipline of hospitality like none I've ever encountered. And it is this discipline of hospitality I want to bring before us today for our reflection. And this is on the surface about how we greet people in our homes, in our church, but really the discipline of hospitality as a religious act asks you whether or not you're willing to share the world. Whether or not the way you behave with other human beings says this is a safe place. I'm not on the defensive here with you. Now, I know from my own experience how tempting it is not to share the world at all, but to take this practiced posture of defense and isolation from other people. Perhaps, like me, you found that I can isolate myself from other human beings in an instant. It comes in the generalizations that I make about people who disagree with me or vote differently than I do. Instead of sharing the world and letting down my defenses, I so often isolate from others by telling myself old, tired stories that the world is a dangerous place that's not to be trusted. And I notice those concrete moments of separating myself from others when I cross the street or when I lock the car door in particular parts of town, because people who appear to be other are too close. I don't like to admit that, but I do it. I find myself isolating from others and not sharing the world in this frantic, hurried consumption, this need to fill some sort of gap. I've got everything I need. I feel this isolation that's so easy to fall into, and I think that a real genuine hospitality that asks me to let down my ego, to let down my posturing and defenses, and let the people I encounter in this place and in my life know that it's a safe moment is not easy to come by. Now, do any of you recognize or remember the commercials that the United Church of Christ put out in 2004? Anybody? Okay, so this was a series of commercials that they put out in 2004 that NBC and CBS refused to air because they at the time included the very controversial religious message that all people are welcome in the United Church of Christ. So, for those of you who didn't see the commercial, what it pans out, and there's a church and a long line of people waiting to get in on a Sunday morning, except it's set up like a nightclub. There are velvet ropes that snake back and forth up until they get to the front door of the sanctuary. And when they do, there are two large men standing there as bouncers. They turn to each couple and each person, deciding whether or not they're welcome there, sending some away, welcoming some in. This commercial's only about 30 seconds, but at the end there's a line that comes across the screen that says, "Jesus didn't turn people away, neither do we." So I remember I was in seminary at the time, and I remember having conversations with other Unitarian Universalists and how often we said, "Hey, that should have been our commercial." Wait, that's our message. They have stolen our message. And I missed at the time the irony of being selfish about the message of hospitality. I recognize that there's nothing wrong with wanting to promote the idea that a genuinely hospitable, radically welcoming environment is something that we long for. But I missed at that time how clouded my vision was thinking that we came up with that idea. I missed at the time how clouded my vision was thinking that we did it better than other people, or that we didn't have a lot of work to do. I missed at the time thinking that when the doors were open to everybody, we'd done our work. I sometimes hear people say, and have said myself, that the end goal of our church is that kind of freedom, where the doors are open, you can come and go as you please. But that can't be the end goal of our church. Now, in the modern expression of the free church, the tradition that we've taken on, especially in America, especially in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country, especially in our hyper-individualistic, hyper-consumer-driven culture, it is so easy for us in the free church to tell ourselves that once the velvet ropes have been removed, we are now engaged in hospitality. Simply saying that all people are welcome in our congregation is a passive form of hospitality at its best. And if left unchecked, it's benign neglect. My guess is that in our own homes, we wouldn't welcome a new guest in by saying, "Well, the door will be open when you get here, and you might want to have a good guess at finding where the cups are, and I'll probably be in the back talking to my friends when you get here." Oh, you recognize that? Yeah. It's not just our problem. People of all churches have it, but we can do just that. We're a people who have seen what forceful religion looks like. We don't like seeing creeds or doctrine or religion forced down people's throat, and sometimes, in a very well-meaning way, we think it's a good thing to let people figure it out on their own. Now, we don't want to force our community on others in these walls or outside, but it is so tempting to tell ourselves in the free church that it's actually a virtue to leave people alone, or to tell them that we will not ask something radically transformative of them when they get here, or to promise that it will be easy, or to tell them it's okay because here we can believe whatever we want. Now, I've said before in the pulpit here that I'm often confused when people describe our church as the place where people can go to be free to believe whatever they want. Because personally, it's not an attractive invitation to me. I can believe in many gods or none at a bar, or a sporting event, or the mall, or in my living room drinking coffee with the New York Times. And in all of these other options, in fact, you can believe many things in most Christian churches around town, to be honest. But in all of these other options, I could save myself the cost of a generous pledge, or the hard spiritual work, or the concrete acts of service that our congregation is going to ask of you if you join it. In a world where you can get the sermon on your smartphone, or where you can get any piece of factual information that we teach at a public library or your computer, my guess is that the people who come into these walls on a Sunday morning want to be human together. Together. Now, I took paternity leave during Lent. I gave up sleep. And during my own little hermitage period, I spent my downtime reading about the early history of the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the early Christian monasteries. These are the people in our tradition, if we go back far enough, who asked, how do we live together and share the world in meaningful ways? And I came across a really interesting story of a man named St. Pachomius. He's said to be the founder of the monastery movement in Christianity. This man's born in the year 292 in Egypt, under the rule of the Roman Empire. And Rome goes to war with Persia, and when they went into a large war, they did what they often did. They went into the local villages and the countryside and rounded up young men to be conscripts to fight in the war, whether they wanted to or not. And Pachomius, at the age of 20, was one of these men. He was put into shackles and put on a boat with the other young men and sent to the city of Thebes. When he got there, they took him and the other young men and put them in jail. Roman soldiers were also Roman prisoners, so they couldn't desert from the war. The first night that he was sitting in his cell, a group of locals came up and got very close to the bars of the cell and put their hands through and started offering food and comfort to the captive recruits inside. The people who wrote his biography said that St. Pachomius turned to the people who had been in jail longer than him, and he said, "Who are those people? Why would they be nice to me? They don't even know me." And the people who had been in jail longer than he had said, "Oh, those people are Christians. That's what they do." So those Christians who found their ways to the bars of his cell didn't introduce themselves as such. They were known not by what they believed or what they didn't believe, but simply by how they treated one another. Their goal was not their creeds or their lack thereof. They cared about feeding hungry people and clothing the naked and caring for people in need. St. Pachomius learned something about the nature of the holy that day. As the rabbi said, "I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you visited me." Now, I know that a cross-species comparison doesn't always work well, but I did love that image of those elephants coming together in the clearing to meet one another. They're making roars and trumpeting. They're putting their tusks around one another and dancing and stomping the ground and almost crying. And when I read that description in Katie Payne's book for the first time, the image that came into my mind was a sharp contrast with how isolated and lonely we can be in our modern age. I thought about these creatures who had only been apart for a few hours. And then I thought of me. And how often intentionally I race past someone so that I don't have to talk to them. Or lower my eyes in public or in an elevator or at the supermarket. How often I use harsh rhetoric about us and them, that modern addictive posture I get of staring down into my iPhone. How often I can race through life forgetting that there are other people who need care. So we took a recent survey in our congregation as part of our strategic plan about trying to be a welcoming, caring, inclusive community. And I have to tell you, I was surprised by the results we got. So many members of our church told us that they don't feel equipped to greet people they don't know. A lot of people wrote back to us and said they feel like they're going to mess it up. And I was shocked by this at first, but I was reminded that we don't have a lot of places in our society where people are A, encouraged, or B, taught how to greet people they don't already know and do it with kindness. So often we're consumers or competitors, and simply to greet another human being that's not a transaction, we're just not used to it. People in our church said that they were afraid that in a church this big, they were going to walk up to somebody who's been here for 30 years and ask them, "Is it your first Sunday in church?" People said they were afraid that they would bother someone by talking to them. People said that they didn't know what to talk about, or that they were afraid they wouldn't be an expert at explaining our church if somebody asked. Well, there's some good news in all of this. If you don't know somebody, you don't know them, whether they've been here for 30 minutes or 30 years. So consider yourself having permission to go up and introduce yourself. And hopefully, if you've been here for 30 years, the church has done a little work, and you will offer them a kind response if they ask if it's your first Sunday. I recently sat down with Tracy McShann, who's our Director of Congregational Life, and we talked about some concrete ways that we can greet one another in sacred ways here, and they're really pretty mundane. It starts with wear your name tag. I'm guilty of this one myself. But what it does is, if we don't, it sends the implicit message that we're special, and if you were a part of our community, you'd already know who I am. Don't worry about being perfect in what you say to people. It's not what you say, but how you say it and that you say it. Maybe just start with saying, "We're glad you're here," and mean it. Don't worry about being an expert. Don't worry about being pushy. Hospitality is not evangelizing, right? There's a difference, and people confuse them. Your job isn't to sell anybody on this church. Your job isn't to convince them about any great truth or save their soul. Just welcome them. And think about how you might do it in your own home. Greet their eyes, say hello, offer them something to drink and a place to sit, preferably next to you in the sermon. Now, in the most practical sense of how we greet one another, this is kind of mundane hospitality, but it matters. Most church studies suggest that the single most important factor in anybody's visit to a congregation is whether or not the place felt friendly. Not what they believed. Whether or not the people there seemed friendly. And we shouldn't dismiss this. Most people have made this decision, they tell us, on how they were treated walking into the sanctuary and walking out of the sanctuary. Not by the minister or the music director, but by the members of the church. In fact, most people tell us in studies that they've made a decision about whether or not a community is welcoming within the first 10 minutes. That's long before they've ever heard me talk. We can talk about inclusion, and we can talk about radical hospitality all we want in the free church, but people will know what we love by how we act. In Ellen Bass's poem, she asked, "What if you knew you'd be the last one to touch someone?" And that's actually less abstract than you think it is. I can't tell you how many moments and stories I've heard in our church and in others of a person who told us that the handshake they got in the fellowship hall or the receiving line was literally the only physical human contact they have in a week. There are countless stories of people in our congregation and others who have said they only hear the words "I love you" said out loud in church. I love you. This isn't about a church growth tactic. This is about how we live our values. This is people coming into our lives here and saying, "Look, I'm in this isolated society where it's so easy to judge me by the number in my bank account. America values me by where I live or what I drive or what I do or how I buy. Are you going to take a minute to stop and see me? Are you going to take a second to stop and see me before you know what I believe? And after? Is there room for me in your life?" Now, you know that this is about more than just how we greet people here on Sunday mornings. This is about asking whether or not the way you walk through the world says to those who meet you, "I'm willing to share the world with you." How do you think they would describe our church at prison? Do they know us? How would the people at the bars of their cells describe our congregation or you? My prayer is that our legacy as a congregation and a faith is not for the empty space that we can create, not as the people who can believe whatever they want, but the people who have decided we will love beyond belief. That we've decided we love you before you come in the door. We've decided we love you before we know what you believe, when we know what you believe, and after we know what you believe. Because we realize the superficial human labels we so often use are nothing compared to the deep humanity that moves in us. It may sound silly or simple or naive, but the everyday little ways we greet one another are ways that you can either practice great truths about the universe or cover them up. The great truth that we are all in this together, especially the people you disagree with. The old Universalists used to say, you better get to loving your enemies because you'll be in heaven with them. The way that you greet people in your life, your friends, your family members, the people that you love, the strangers you meet in this church, is a way to practice the truth that we're all deserving of love. That we don't know what happens after this life, and so we better get to loving each other while we're alive. And what a relief it would be to let go of the decades of practice we have at isolating ourselves from others and feeling special and unique and set apart and simply stop and make room. What a relief that would be. So like the new life who is asking to be welcomed into my home right now, the people who come into this congregation looking for community or the people that you meet in your life are not going to be benefited most by being left alone. The world will find its comfort by being held close and loved. In her poem, Ellen Bass asked, what would it look like if we saw people as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless and pinned against time? Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to take on the advanced practice of our church, not the passive one. The one that asks you to look into the eyes of every single human being you meet, try for the rest of the day, and imagine that they are a cracked, imperfect, beautiful, holy vessel. May you greet one another with kindness and care. May you know not what you are free from, but what you are free for. May you rest and know that you are home, that you are loving and loved all the days of your life. What a day we have. Let's make use of it.